Greetings. I'm excited to share today with you one of my absolute favorites. This is my copy of Beyond Good and Evil. I got it when I was 16. It was actually the first, philosophy book that I ever bought, and I wrote some papers on it and whatnot. Actually, one of them for this class, when I had it at Spring Arbor, actually. So, really excited to share this with you. I'm going to go over the answers to your pretest. Remember, these are questions that you will see on the final exam. They're not the only questions you'll see, but those are some of them. So I guess before we dive into Section 5, Toward a Natural History of Morals, I'll go through those answers, and then I just want to say a couple of things to kind of prepare you for our reading today. So, this English social contact, This English social contract theorist and father of classical liberalism was influential on American statesmen such as Thomas Jefferson, with his emphasis on self-ownership and his labor theory of property, that owning one's labor, one also owned the products of that labor. That was C. John Locke. This German, specifically Prussian, political theorist argued that perpetual peace could only be maintained by, or could be maintained by, a federated alliance of enlightened republics. That was D. Kant. This English utilitarian emphasized a qualitative difference between experiences that produced, quote, happiness. This was John Stuart Mill. Reacting negatively to the French Revolution, this Anglo-Irish politician and political philosopher argued in favor of adherence to tried and true methods of governance built on long tradition, rather than wholesale application of reason to construct new institutions or entities. That was A. Burke. Author of The Wealth of Nations, this Scottish Enlightenment thinker set out the tenets of classical economics, illustrating that diversification of labor, free trade, and minimal government intervention would lead to the greatest of all possible outcomes for society. That was D. Smith. The father of utilitarianism, this English progressive liberal set out to measure behavior on the basis of his principle of, quote, utility, expressed as a measure of the, quote, greatest happiness of the greatest number. This was B. Bentham. This French political theorist, spirit of the laws, particularly his chapter on checks and balances, was to have a profound effect on the framers of the American Constitution. That was A. Montesquieu. In this book, technically a pair of books, the French politician and theorist Alexis de Tocqueville made several prescient observations about the benefits and perils of American democracy. This was D. Democracy in America. And then these essays, authored by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, sought to defend the American Constitution from its critics, who argued it centralized too much power in the hands of a future central government. That was the Federalist Papers. So, hopefully you did okay there on that. So Nietzsche here. We're nearing the end of our time together, and as you probably noticed, our reading today, this was the first reading that we've had really that wasn't very obviously political. It has to do with morality, epistemology, but the point here is important, and it is because we are moving from a period of the Enlightenment, of classical liberalism. By the end of the century, by the end of the 19th century, classical liberalism is essentially dead. And Nietzsche really represents the new value system, which is power. I actually have a great quote here that by a fellow German, actually, Heinrich von Treitschke. The old liberalism is dead. The idea of increased state autonomy, the idea of power, has replaced it. It is this idea that inspires leading men everywhere. We talked about that divergence between classical liberals and progressive liberals. Well, even the progressive liberals are going to very much be absorbed by the statists, those who want increased state power. These intellectuals are going to, people like, in the American case, John Dewey, John Dewey was thrilled by American involvement in World War I because he thought it gave the government the opportunity to use its intellectuals to reorganize society in a way that the intellectuals would think better. And this is something that is going to be an increasing tendency, the move away from actual democracy in America. So I'll real quick here go through the reading and talk to you a little bit about Nietzsche and where we're going from here, because there will, of course, be many more tracts on political philosophy written in the 20th century, of course. We will talk about some of them, but the idea of the individual, the sacrosanctity of individual rights, that's all pretty much dead. It's going to be a question of how much is the state willing to grant you. So, in Beyond Good and Evil, Section 5, Toward a Natural History of Morals, Nietzsche examines morality through a critical and genealogical lens. He argues that moral systems are not universal truths, but rather contingent historical constructs shaped by human psychology, culture, and power dynamics. And he critiques traditional moral systems, particularly Christian morality, for fostering values like humility, self-denial, and pity, which he sees as expressions of weakness, or, quote, slave mentality. Nietzsche contrasts this with, quote, master morality, which emerges from strength, self-assertion, and the affirmation of life. And he suggests that moral values are deeply tied to the instincts and life conditions of the groups that create them, and thus morality must be studied as part of the natural history of humanity rather than as a fixed set of divine or rational laws. So some of the key themes that he touches on in this section are things like moral relativism, that morality varies across time and culture, that there's a psychological origin of morals, that moral values reflect the psychological needs of different groups. And of course, a big part of this is his critique of Christianity. He says that Christian values are rooted in the resentment of the weak against the strong. And Nietzsche challenges readers to rethink the origins and functions of their moral beliefs, urging them to kind of overcome passive acceptance of these inherited values. So, some of the other key aspects that he goes into here. Nietzsche is going to reject metaphysical systems, whether it be Platonism, Christianity, that posit a higher or unchanging realm of truth or morality. He sees those kinds of systems as life-denying, as they devalue the physical world and human instincts. And I'll get to his whole death of God argument, but the will to power. Nietzsche describes the driving force behind all human action as the, quote, will to power, an inherent desire to assert, expand, and enhance one's strength and influence. This concept underpins his interpretation of morality, culture, and individual creativity. I already touched on the slave and master morality, but this plays into this idea of the overman, the Übermensch. Nietzsche envisions the overman as an individual who transcends conventional morality, embraces life with all its challenges, and creates new values. And this figure embodies the affirmation of existence and the rejection of nihilism. Eternal recurrence. Nietzsche proposes the idea of eternal recurrence, and it's a thought experiment where one imagines living the same life over and over and over for eternity. And he uses this concept to really challenge individuals to live authentically and fully embrace their self, because you're going to have to live this life over and over. So, sorry. That being said, it should be kind of obvious that Nietzsche is a stark departure from everyone that we've been talking about here, because he's not a collectivist. He is not interested in equality, which is something progressive liberals were interested in. He's not interested in the values of classical liberalism with their foundation in natural rights. So he's going somewhere completely different. And really, we might call him sort of sort of a proto-postmodernist, because of his radical questioning of objective truths, meta-narratives, absolute moral systems. He is going to be very influential on several postmoderns, as we'll talk about here. But that's kind of where I want you to see him. So we're in the late 19th century, and so we talked about the idea of capital M modernism, this idea that that through human reason we could achieve higher and higher levels of development and come closer and closer and closer to discovering the actual capital T truths about existence and the world through human reason. That is the capital M modernist project. That's all going to be destroyed by World War I, and then the interwar period. World War I and World War II, they're very close together, and really it's better to think of it as really like a 30-year period of European civil war. And then out of that comes postmodernism. So really, Nietzsche is standing here at the cusp of the 20th century, and he is essentially rejecting the Enlightenment project, rejecting the progressive project, saying the actual value is going to be the will to power. And this is something that's going to be picked up on by and this is very much of a keeping. He is not himself a social Darwinist, but of course Darwin's work and social Darwinism was becoming very prominent in the late 19th century. And this idea being that, life is a contest and that only the strong will survive and strive. And so it's this idea that power is the ultimate value. So just now that you have that kind of idea of where Nietzsche is chronologically, I just want to give you sort of some of his philosophical antecedents and then talk about some of his acolytes there. So in terms of Greek philosophy, Heraclitus was one, because Heraclitus had an emphasis on flux and becoming, which really resonates with Nietzsche's dynamic view of life and rejection of static being. So to the sophists, the sophists, their relativism and critique of absolute truth really echo Nietzsche's perspectivism. Protagoras said, man is the measure of all things. Obviously, I already mentioned Nietzsche did not like Plato. Enlightenment thinkers, as I said, Nietzsche rejected their moral absolutism, and he was very skeptical of people like Rousseau's egalitarianism. Schopenhauer was very important in his development. The will to live very much mirrors the will to power, although he would deviate from Schopenhauer in important ways. He wasn't so pessimistic and life-denying in his asceticism. One of the models for Nietzsche's ideal of the Übermensch was Goethe, the great German artist. Nietzsche would also engage with, as I said, things like Darwinism and positivism, but he wasn't totally enamored with these things because he saw them as mechanistic and reductive. And so I already mentioned that he would be highly influential on the post-war postmodernists. This includes people like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, also Martin Heidegger, who was actually, prior to that, he was technically an existentialist. So too Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus. So Friedrich Nietzsche, very, very influential, profoundly influential. So Nietzsche really stands as a bridge at the end of the 19th century. He's a radical critic of most of Western philosophical tradition's foundations, from Socratic rationalism to Christian morality to Enlightenment reason. His work disrupts the assumption of universal truths and stable identities, challenging both metaphysics and morality. And so, again, while he's not strictly a postmodernist, I think it's fair to see him as a clear forerunner of postmodernism, with his focus on power dynamics, perspectivism, and critique of meta-narratives. Now, one of the reasons I had you read this, even though it wasn't strictly political, is let's go back to Marx last week, where we talked about Marx argued that the political structure was merely a function of the economic base. In the same way here, you could definitely read Nietzsche as being similar, in the sense that political ideology is not going to be a function of really anything other than power. And I want to be very careful here, because Nietzsche himself was not terribly political. He thought politics was crass and stupid, and he had lots of criticisms of all different sorts. And it's important to not conflate what he actually thought with things people later ascribed to him. So let's actually get into that. So Nietzsche, of course, lived during the rise of German nationalism, but he was deeply critical of it, actually. He really despised the chauvinistic nationalism of people like the pan-German nationalists, because he viewed nationalism as collectivist, the herd-like mentality that suppressed individual creativity and greatness. So, Nietzsche would, for example, mock the idea of German superiority. And he also, importantly, because this is something that's not always known about him, he rejected anti-Semitism, which was gaining serious traction in nationalist circles, not only in Germany and France as well. So again, he saw this emphasis on national pride as a distraction from the cultivation of higher individuals. Instead of nationalism, Nietzsche actually envisioned kind of a unified European culture led by exceptional individuals who could transcend parochial, local identities and create new values. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Nietzsche viewed liberalism, with its emphasis on equality, rights, or with its emphasis on rights. Did I have democracy on there? Yes. So liberalism and democracy. So Nietzsche viewed liberalism and democracy, with their varied emphases on rights, equality, and majority rule, as a symptom of the slave morality. And he argued that these ideas stemmed from resentment, where the weak sought to undermine the strong by imposing values like equality and fairness on them. He saw egalitarianism as life-denying, suppressing the will to power and stifling human excellence. And again, he of course dismissed concepts like natural rights as metaphysical illusions, part of the Christian moral framework that he was seeking to deconstruct. For Nietzsche, the essence of life is struggle and the pursuit of power. And he believed that conflict and hardship were essential for growth and the development of greatness. And this idea aligns with the social Darwinian emphasis on competition, though, again, Nietzsche's concept of the will to power transcended biological survival and is more about self-overcoming and creativity. And Nietzsche rejected the modern emphasis on comfort, security, and stability, which he believed bred mediocrity. He advocated embracing risk, struggle, and suffering as the paths to true human flourishing. Nietzsche's political vision, if it's anything, it's just profoundly elitist. He believed in the importance of cultivating exceptional individuals, Übermenschen, who could transcend societal norms and embody the highest potential of humanity. These figures, through their will to power, would create new values and lead humanity forward. Nietzsche would therefore deride the herd mentality of the masses, viewing them as pretty much incapable of creating or appreciating greatness. So, sort of, if you want to think of it as an artistic aristocracy, he imagined a society that would prioritize art, culture, and philosophy, led by an aristocracy of spirit rather than of birth or wealth. And just to emphasize here again, While Nietzsche shares some affinities with the social Darwinism of his time, especially the emphasis on struggle and the rejection of equality, he diverged in some pretty key ways. Nietzsche's will to power is not limited to biological survival or reproduction. It is more about creativity, ambition, and self-overcoming. Unlike many social Darwinists too, who emphasize the fitness of nations or races, if you've ever read any like Teddy Roosevelt, you know what I'm talking about here. Nietzsche focused on the individual as the site of struggle and greatness. It was not about the race. It was not about the nation. Nietzsche's disdain for politics, as practiced at his time, is very interesting because, of course, he would be later misappropriated, I would argue, by 20th century fascist movement, particularly by the Nazis, who distorted his concept of the Übermensch to justify their ideology of racial superiority. However, this was largely facilitated by his sister, who edited and manipulated his writings to align with the nationalist and anti-Semitic agendas that he had actually explicitly opposed. So he is elitist, and really he is anti-politics. Nietzsche rejects mass politics and ideological movements in any attempt to build systematic political theories. His critiques were really aimed at cultural, moral, and philosophical assumptions, rather than an actual political program. So, of course, despite his anti-political stance, his ideas have profoundly influenced political philosophy and theory. His critique of universal values and objective truths, as I said, inspired postmodern thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, who applied his genealogical method to deconstruct power structures, ideologies, and moral systems in politics. Nietzsche's skepticism about democracy and egalitarianism influenced critics of liberalism like Carl Schmitt, who was one of the Nazi ideologists. So really, Nietzsche's political thought is best understood as a critique of prevailing ideologies rather than a programmatic vision. He rejected the idea of the possibility of a programmatic vision or even of its usefulness because, again, it was just something that was going to smother the individual. And so Nietzsche, much in the same way that he is challenging the reader to reconsider the foundations of moral and cultural values, he's also trying to get you as a reader to question the foundations of political systems. So, the death of God. One of his most famous quotes. God is dead, we have killed him. Nietzsche did predict that the death of God would lead to the rise of new belief systems. And if you look at the syllabus, you'll see the new religions on there. These new religions were things like nationalism, socialism, and other isms, other ideologies, which would function as substitutes for religion. And he foresaw that these secular religions would generate conflicts as fervent and as destructive as the religious wars of the past. So he talks about these things specifically in other works, not in Beyond Good and Evil, but since this is probably the one quote that if anyone knows a quote by him, it's that one, that God is dead, we have killed him. It was in The Gay Science and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So what he's referring to here, again, is the decline of traditional religious belief as science and technology sort of took their place, made religious belief less and less important to life. And it was not a celebratory announcement, but a profound warning about the cultural and existential vacuum that this would create. Because without God, Nietzsche believed humanity would lose the foundation for its values, leading to kind of a crisis of nihilism. And so, because of that, Nietzsche, again, predicted that in the absence of traditional religion, people would seek meaning in new ideologies. So, one of the most dangerous that he saw, and of course, having lived during the period of German National Union, he actually served in the Prussian army, he saw the rise of the nation state and nationalist fervor as dangerous manifestations of herd instinct and resentment, offering a false sense of belonging and purpose. And he noted how nationalism, like religion, demanded unwavering loyalty and sacrifice, turning individuals into tools for collective goals. So Nietzsche's writings there also contain some prescient warnings there about these wars that he foresaw would come, one of which being these new wars, while they would be similar to the religious wars of old, these new ideological wars of the future driven by secular faiths like nationalism or socialism, he believed that they would be even worse because they lacked the tempering effect of transcendent moral frameworks. They would be rooted solely in human will to power. So, Nietzsche accurately foresaw the emergence of nationalism and other secular ideologies as basically new religions, and he anticipated their capacity to produce conflicts of extraordinary violence and power. So his critique there was very apt. And again, the old liberalism is dead. The idea of increased state autonomy, the idea of power has replaced it. It is this idea that inspires leading men everywhere. And so from here, where we're going, so what happens? In 20 years' time, the Europeans will fight World War I. It will be devastating in a way that no wars had been before. It completely smashes all illusions that the application of science and reason and technology is going to lead human beings to higher and higher levels of living. The interwar period will produce sort of anti-rationalist ideologies like Nazism, and out the other side you will get debates about liberalism and about positive and negative rights, and we'll talk about them a little bit. But overwhelmingly, classical liberalism is pretty much dead. It will pretty much just be a debate between those who believe that you owe some amount of positive rights versus some who believe you owe somewhat more. We're going to talk about Berlin. We're going to do some Rawls. I will mention Nozick. If you decide to read Rothbard, you'll get a good taste of anarcho-capitalism, which is sort of classical liberalism on steroids, I guess. Yeah, so one thing that we've talked about is in terms of political ideology and in terms of political forms, we've seen that there are a very limited number. We've just been talking about really the same types of political systems and really very similar political ideologies going all the way back to the ancients. And so Wednesday, when we meet, we will start doing some wrap-up stuff. I'll also be posting a third pre-test. Again, I'm sorry that we were not able to meet today. Just being sick. I did not want to get you all sick, especially in the run-up to finals here. If you have any questions, please email me. Don't forget to be working on your papers. And I look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday.